Hello again. In this video, we're going to cover Chapter 5 on the IS and LM curves. You might notice I look a little different than the other videos. That's because in the latest edition of the book, the 7th edition, they've changed this chapter quite a bit. And so I have to redo the video to reflect that. There's another implication, though. If you're using a previous edition of the textbook, say the 6th or earlier, this chapter is going to be quite a bit different. Another chapter we're going to cover, Chapter 9, is not even in the old book at all. It's replaced another chapter and it's written in a completely different way. And they've reordered the numbering a little bit. So if you're using a previous edition of the book, it's probably not going to work very well from here on out. So just thought I'd let you know that. Okay. In this video, what we're going to do is put the goods market and the money market together. So we've talked about the goods market in terms of the 45-degree line diagram, looked at the money demand, money supply curve. We're going to take the goods market, derive something called an IS curve. We'll take the money market, derive something called an LM curve, then we can put them together, and together we can find that one unique point. It's going to turn out to be a combination of the interest rate and income that gives us an overall economy-wide equilibrium. It's an equilibrium in both of those markets at the same time. So that's where we're headed. And you'll see how it works as we go along here. So let's start with the goods market. Now, up to this point, our model of the goods market has been something like, well, not something like, it has been, Y equals C of disposable income, consumption, plus I bar, plus G bar. So consumption dependent upon disposable income, both investment and government spending, were assumed to be completely exogenous. Now for government spending, that's a decent assumption. For investment, that was a simplifying assumption, and we're going to need to fix that at this point. So what we're going to say now is that investment is some function of the interest rate and income. And we're going to assume that as the interest rate goes up, investment goes down. So there's a negative relationship. So when R goes up, investment goes down. For those of you who've had calculus, what we're saying is the partial of I with respect to R is less than 0. And for income, we're going to say when income goes up, when GDP goes up, investment tends to go up. So I of Y, the partial of I with respect to Y, is going to be greater than 0. This I of R parameter, this relationship between the interest rate and income, will play a big role later. And we'll come to that. Okay, now let me explain this a little more. Why is this negative and why is this a positive relationship? So let's talk about the relationship between investment and income first. So let's just think of a single firm. All firms would be doing something similar. Let's take and look at a bunch of potential investment projects. And let's just arbitrarily name them A, B, C, D, and E. And each one of these projects will have an expected rate of return on the investment. So let's say this first one's really good project, you think, so you expect 14%. This one's not as great, but still pretty good, 11%. Get to C, we're falling down to 6%, 4%, 2% for E. And so we've got these ordered in terms of their expected rates of return. We can also I'm just making up these numbers, but let's just do some costs. Maybe this first one's $1 million. Maybe the second one, $2 million. Third one, $400,000. Fourth one, I don't know, $1.5 million. And the last one, $3 million. So then the question is, how many of these projects should the firm undertake? So let's assume that the interest rate to begin with is 12%. Pretty high interest rate, but it'll work for an example. At a 12% rate of interest, Project A would be worthwhile because you're going to earn 14% on your $1 million investment. It's going to cost you 12% to borrow the money, or even if it's your own money, retained earnings, you could lend it out at 12% because that's the interest rate. So that's your opportunity cost. That's what's going to cost you to invest in this project. So you're going to make a 2% net rate of return. But when you get to project B, you're not going to want to invest because you're going to have a negative 1% expected revenues minus costs. So in this case, only investment A would be undertaken, so investment would be $1 million. Now suppose that the interest rate falls to, let's say, 8%. Well, now project B is going to also pay, but C won't. So now your investment would be A plus B. So your total investment would go from $1 million to $3 million. And we can imagine all the firms all across the country doing this. So as the interest rate falls, more and more investment projects become viable, become expected profitable, and you'll get more and more investment. And you can see if the interest rate kept falling to, say, 5%, then your investment would be $3,400,000. If it falls to 3%, you're going to invest in D. And if it somehow fell to 1%, you'd also invest in E. So as that interest rate goes down, more and more investment projects become profitable, and investment tends to go up. So that's really all there is to the relationship between the interest rate and investment. As the interest rate goes down, it's less costly to borrow money, so you tend to see more investment. For income, it's a fairly easy thing as well. We just think that, well, as income goes up, as GDP goes up, firms are going to be more confident about the future. They could be running into capacity problems. They need to expand because GDP is growing, their customer base, their sales are growing, that sort of thing. So as GDP goes up, we tend to see more investment. And so that's all there is to it. So our model is going to be Y equals C of Y minus T plus I of R and Y plus G. And I won't always remember to put the bar on G, but we'll just understand that that is an exogenous variable. Now, our goal here to derive this thing called the IS curve is to work out the relationship between interest rate and income. If I change the interest rate, how does income have to change to keep this inequality? Okay. Now, we've already drawn a picture of this. What we did was put income on this axis. They called it Z in the book, but it's aggregate demand. This thing, that's demand. Z is demand. And we noted that you can model this as a 45-degree line diagram and then put this function C plus I plus G, and then where that intersects gives us our level of income. Now what we want to do is work out how income, if I change the interest rate's in this function I of R and Y. There's also a Y minus T in there, but I don't need it. If I change that R, how does income change at equilibrium? So if I call this initial interest rate R0, that's supposed to be a comma there. If I let the interest rate go down to R1, what's going to happen? Well, investment's going to go up, right? So investment will go up. You'll have C plus I of R1 Y plus G, where R1 is less than R0. And so what's going to happen is income will go up. So when R goes down, income goes up. So it looks like there's a negative relationship between the interest rate and income. So let's do this a little more systematically. We can actually derive this thing called the IS curve graphically. What we're going to need are two different graphs. So we're going to need a 45-degree line. And down here, we'll keep track of the relationship between the interest rate and income. So this was income Z, aggregate demand. We have the 45-degree line diagram. And let's call this C plus I of R0 plus G. I'm just dropping the other arguments for clarity. So at an interest rate of R0, income is Y0. So let's come down here. Here's Y0. And let's just, R0 is somewhere on here. Let's just say it's right there. Okay? So that's our initial equilibrium point in the goods market. So this is the goods market. That's one pair R and Y. That's an equilibrium. Now what we want to do is drop the interest rate to R1 and see what happens. Well, if we drop the interest rate to R1, this is going to shift up to C plus I of R1 plus G. Not a very good R1 there. And now income goes up to Y1. So at an interest rate of R1, income is Y1. Now we could keep doing this. I could pick an interest rate here or here. Let's just pick one even a little lower, R2, D2. So at R2, this is going to go up again, C plus I of R2 plus G. Keep forgetting that parenthesis. That's pretty messy. C plus I of R1 plus G, C plus I of R2 plus G. Let me make sure that's on the screen. Yep. And so now at R2, income goes up to Y2. Find that point down here. So here's R2 and Y2. So you can see we're starting to map out a curve. If I were to pick every possible interest rate, it would show me every possible income, and what would happen is I would map out some curve, and we're going to call that the IS curve. So the IS curve just keeps track of all the equilibrium pairs, R0, Y0, R1, Y1, R2, Y2, all the equilibrium pairs in the goods market. So it's every possible combination R and Y that's an equilibrium in the goods market. Now, why is it called the IS curve? IS stands for investment equals saving. And we're using an income equals expenditures approach. So we're using Y equals C plus I plus G. This side is expenditures. This side is income. And so Y equals E is our equilibrium. But you can also write income as consumption plus savings plus taxes. That's all the uses of your income, right? They take taxes out of your paycheck, you take it home, you either consume it or save it. Okay, so what we can do is cross out those C's, they cancel, so S plus T equals I plus G. This is what we call voluntary savings. That's the savings you want to make. This is forced savings in some sense. This is the amount the government makes you save out of your paycheck for things like Social Security, or it takes it and spends it, but it takes it, you can think of it as savings. Similarly here, this is private investment. And this is government investment. So altogether we have savings, both private and public, equals investment, which is both private and public. Or if the budget's in balance, which in the 1930s when they first started using these models, it wasn't unheard of for t equal to g. It's a little bit strange for us these days. And in that case, S equals I. So our equilibrium is y equals E. I don't think you can see that up there, can you? Oh, maybe so. So our equilibrium is income equals expenditures, but mathematically it's equivalent to savings equals investment in a more general term. So the IS curve is just investment equals savings. It's just a way of saying it's the goods market equilibrium. Okay, let's do shifts in the IS curve next. Make sure I got everything I wanted to say. Looks like it. So what we need to figure out is what makes the IS curve shift in or shift out. And really, it's pretty simple. Anything that causes aggregate demand to go up, except a change in the interest rate when you move along the IS curve. Anything else that causes demand to go up will cause the IS curve to shift out. So let's do a couple of examples of that. So we're going to show this graphically. So we're going to show how the IS curve shifts with these double graph models. So down here we have the IS curve, R and Y. Here's the 45-degree line diagram. And I'm going to use government spending as my first example, but you'll see that, so I'm going to call this C plus I plus G0. You'll see it's the same for other things as well. So here's Y0. Now let's assume we've already derived the IS curve, and let's just find this equilibrium point, which is Y0 and R0. So in I here, there's an R0. It's I of R0. Now, if we let government spending go up, so what we're going to do is we're going to let government spending go up, holding R constant. And that's important. So maybe I should actually highlight that. Sorry about this for your notes. This is I of R0 plus G0. So we're at R0, Y0, and G0. We're going to increase government spending, but we're going to keep R at R0. All right? So let's do that. We already know how what happens here. We've done this before. When government spending goes up, this will shift to C plus I, still at R0, plus G1. And so now we're at an income level of Y1, but the interest rate is R0. So we're at that point. Now this is an equilibrium in the goods market, so it has to be on the IS curve. So that tells us that the IS curve must have shifted from IS of G0 to IS, not I, IS of G1. So when government spending goes up, the IS curve shifts out. Now notice that this shift would have been the same if I had cut taxes, if there had been an increase in consumer confidence, an increase in business confidence, anything that shifts this up, except a change in the interest rate, which would move us from there to there. Anything that shifts this up other than a change in the interest rate is going to cause the IS curve to shift out. So if we wanted to do taxes, all we'd have to do is just relabel these. Let's do a tax cut instead. Well, it's exactly the same, except you have C of Y minus T0 plus I of R0 plus G. And this one, taxes went down, so shifts up, C of y minus T1 plus I of R0 plus G. So again, it's exactly the same. We cut taxes. This curve shifts up, shifts the IS curve out. This is T0. This is T1. T1 less than T0. If we had done consumer confidence, same thing. If confidence went up, this would shift up. Business confidence shifts up. So you get the idea. Anything that shifts the 45-degree line up, and we went all through that earlier in the course, will cause the IS curve to shift out. The four main things that we're going to use in the quizzes and in the class are government spending, taxes, business confidence, and consumer confidence. So G up, T down, confidence up. This will shift up, shifts the IS curve out. And the opposite, of course, would shift the IS curve in. If this had been T0 and this had been T1 and taxes had gone up, we would shift back the other way. And so it works in both directions. So that's the IS curve in terms of how to drive it and what makes it shift. And we'll be using some examples of that once we get the LM curve in. Let's do a little bit on the slope of the IS curve. Now, I'm not going to ask you to do this, but let me do it mathematically first so that those of you who follow this can see that it's really easy to see when you do it mathematically what's going on here. So let's say y, our model is y equals c of y minus t plus I of r and y plus g. We want to find the slope of the IS curve. So there's y and r. So we want dr dy. That would be the slope. So what I need to do is take a total derivative. So if you hopefully you've had multivariate calculus, or they talked about it in regular calculus. And then we'll solve for dr dy. So we're going to totally differentiate this. dy is the partial of c with respect to y minus t, c of y minus t times dy minus dt plus I of r dr plus I of y dy plus dg. So that's what's called the total derivative of that function. Now we want dr dy all else equal. And so we're going to hold taxes constant. So dt is 0. We're going to hold government spending constant. So dg is 0. So now we have dy is c of y minus t dy plus I of r dr plus I of y dy. So dy times 1 minus c of y minus t minus I of y equals I of r dr. So now we have our answer. Dr dy is 1 minus c of y minus t minus I of y over I of r. So that's the slope. So you can see that if consumption goes up, this will be a smaller number. It'll get flatter. If I of y goes up, same thing. This will be flatter. We generally assume, by the way, that c of y minus t plus I of y is less than 1. You run into some problems in the model if that's not true. So when these things go up, they get closer to 1. This gets closer to 0, and the slope falls. Now, I of r is a negative number, but when it goes up in magnitude, like from minus 10 to minus 20, that's actually smaller, but it's bigger in magnitude. When this gets bigger in magnitude, the slope gets flatter. So the bigger I of r is, the flatter the curve will be, and that's going to be important later. So I'm going to show that graphically. I'm going to look at the relation, at how the slope of the IS curve changes when I of R, the responsiveness of investment to interest rate. This is how investment changes when the interest rate changes. We're going to look at how the slope of the IS curve changes when I of R changes. So what I'm going to do is simultaneously derive the IS curve twice under two different assumptions, a small in magnitude I of R or a big absolute value of I sub R. So we know that to derive it, we need this 45-degree line put together with this Y and R graph. So this is Z. I'd prefer to call this E for expenditures, but the book calls it Z. Can't help that. There's Y. So let's start off with here's our 45-degree line. And here's C plus I of R0 plus G. So our starting point is this point Y0 and R0. Now we're going to let R go down, and we're going to have two different assumptions about I of R. One that it's tiny in magnitude, one that it's big in magnitude. And then we're going to see how the curve changes. So let's let R go down to R1 here. Okay? What that parameter does, when R goes down, this shifts up. And the reason it shifts up is because investment goes up. So if I of R were relatively small, if the response of investment to the interest rate is relatively small, this isn't going to shift up very far. And so in that case, it might only shift up to C plus I of R1 plus G. And this is for, I'm going to use absolute value because it's a negative number, and I'm talking about the magnitude. I of R is small. So it doesn't shift up very far. So in that case, our IS curve would look like that. Now we can think of a second case where I of R is a whole lot bigger. If I of R is bigger, for the same fall in the interest rate, investment's going to go up more. And so in that case, might be this, C plus I of R1 plus G. And this is for I of R larger than it was here. So because it's larger, we get a bigger shift, right? So there's Y1 prime. So in that case, we'd be there. So that would be our point on the IS curve. And we can see that the IS curve gets flatter. And so our result is that as I of R, and just we're going to use a word for this. This is how responsive investment is to the interest rate. When it gets more responsive, when a given fall in the interest rate gives you a bigger change in investment, that's going to cause the IS curve to get flatter. And if you go back and look at that slope formula, 1 minus C of Y minus T plus I of Y over I of R, that's dr dy for the IS curve. You can see that as this gets to be a bigger number, this is going to be you're going to get a smaller slope, a flatter curve. And so I of R going up flattens the IS curve. Now why am I spending so much time with what seems like just a technical detail about the slope of the IS curve? Well, this I of R really varies a lot over the business cycle. So when you're at near full employment, investment tends to be fairly responsive to the interest rate. because you're already at capacity, interest rate falls, you want to expand, it's a good time to do it, business is good, you tend to see a lot of investment. In deep recessions, you tend to see less responsiveness of investment to the interest rate. And the reason is that, think of the Great Recession. Firms had idle factories. They have half their trucks, their delivery trucks might be sitting in the lot. Maybe you're a restaurant and half your tables aren't being used. Why would a small fall in the interest rate cause you to do any investment when you already have all this excess capacity? So there's really very little reason to invest. And plus, you're looking forward and thinking, geez, I don't know when things are going to get better. Why should I take a risk now, spending a lot of money on investment when aggregate demand may be down low like it is now for quite a bit of time? So you don't tend to see much responsiveness to the interest rate when you're in a recession. Near full employment, you might be thinking, oh gosh, my restaurant's full, my factory's full, I'm running out of trucks to do delivery. But boy, at the interest rate as high as it is right now, it's just not quite worth it to expand. But the minute that falls, they say, oh, now it's worth it. We went from project A to project B in our earlier example. And now you'll see lots of firms investing. So you see a lot more responsiveness near full employment than in recessions. And that's going to have a big impact on the ability of monetary policy to stimulate the economy, as we'll see later. And so this parameter I of R changing, the responsiveness of investment to the interest rate changing, has important implications for whether we should use monetary or fiscal policy in a recession. And that's something I'll come back to in a few moments. Excuse me for a second. Okay. So I think that pretty much does it for the IS curve. Let's turn to the LM curve. Now we've already looked at a model of the money market. So okay, you can put M on this axis, the interest rate on this axis, and we had a money supply curve and a money demand curve, P, Y, L of I. And this L stood for liquidity preference. The term LM, L usually stands for money demand because it's an old term from Keynes for liquidity preference, which is the way he talked about it. I think we talked about that earlier. And then M is just for the money supply. So what LM means is simply money demand equals money supply. So the LM curve is going to be just like the IS curve was all the points where demand, expenditures equals income, essentially supply equals demand. This is the same thing. It's where money demand equals money supply. All righty. Now we're going to change this just slightly because it makes something we're going to do in a moment easier. Let me show you what we're going to do. Our model is, we say, well, money supply equals M. Money demand equals P, Y, L of I. So money supply equals money demand is M equals P, Y, L of I. And that's what that diagram is showing us. This is the downward sloping line, and this is the vertical line, because we assume the Fed can control the money supply perfectly. It's a little more convenient to just divide by P. Call this real money. Money divided by the price level, that's the purchasing power of a dollar, is equal to Y, L of I. This is real money demand. One way to think of this is money demand. A lot of it's carried around for transactions. So what this is really saying is that this is the amount of stuff you buy in real terms, like the number of oranges or the number of bicycles and so on. So if you hold that constant, if you double prices, you're going to have to double the amount of income that you carry to buy the same amount of stuff. So if we hold this side constant, just double prices, that's going to double M. And what it's saying is, if you're going to buy the same amount of stuff and prices are twice as high as they were before, you should carry twice as much money. And so this is just stating money demand equals money supply in real terms. Now graphically, it's not a whole, oh, I'm using I here. I is the same as R. Most of the time, I is equal to the nominal interest rate and R is equal to the real interest rate. But we don't have any inflation yet, which is the difference between the two, because in the ISLM model, I haven't really said this yet, but the price level is held constant. So Y and R vary, but the price is assumed constant. And so, can't remember the point I was going to make. Oh, and so in this case, I is equal to R. Usually, the nominal interest rate is the real interest rate plus the expected inflation rate. But this is 0 for us right now. Very soon, like by chapter 9 for sure, but even sooner than that, next chapter actually, that assumption will be dropped, and we'll have to distinguish between the real and the nominal interest rate. So I've been slipping between I and R, and I apologize for that, but it doesn't really matter as long as you understand. Alrighty, so let's derive the LM curve. Just like before, except this time we have to put the graphs side by side. I'll explain why. So we want to derive this thing called the LM curve. So we want the relationship between income and the interest rate. And we're going to use this real money demand, money supply diagram to work that out. So this is going to be M over P. We divided through by P. And this term here is going to be YL. I'm going to call this Y0, L of I. So that gives us R0. So we could, last time the two graphs shared the horizontal axis. This was Y in the goods market, so we stacked them vertically. This time they share this axis, so we put them side by side so the axes line up. So I can come over here and figure out, okay, here's R0, and just pick one. It's somewhere. Let's say it's there. There's Y0. Now we want to know what happens if income goes up. Okay. What happens if income goes up? Well, we know that's going to increase money demand, and so what will happen is you'll go to Y1 L of I, L of R. I'm so used to using R, I. So at R1, at Y1, the interest rate would rise to R1. And so we can come over here. Now I could pick a bunch more levels of income, maybe this one, and map out other points. But when we're all done, we'll get this relationship called the LM curve. And what the LM curve is it's all of the combinations of Y and R that are in equilibrium. There's one equilibrium, there's another pair of R and Y that's in equilibrium. So it's every pair R and Y that's in equilibrium in the money market. Before going on, I'm going to backtrack momentarily because there's something I forgot to say about the slope of the IS curve that I meant to do. So that's how you drive the LM curve. We need to look at shifts in the LM curve. Then I need to point out that this is not quite how the book does it, and then I'll reconcile the two for you. Okay, but let me backtrack for just a second. I did the slope of the IS curve graphically, mathematically. I forgot to do it intuitively. So what's the intuition? So if you look at the IS curve, what's going on? So here's R0 and Y0, Y1 and R1. What's going on here is that as we lower the interest rate, investment goes up. And this is where that I of R parameter comes into play. I of R tells you that for a given R fall, how much investment goes up. Then income goes up, and this is by the multiplier. So the multiplier plays a role here, but we're holding that constant, and I of R comes in here. So in this case, we lowered the interest rate, investment went up, and that drove income up. Now, if I of R had been even bigger, what would happen? So this is the first case. Now let I of R be bigger in magnitude. So if I of R goes up, you'll get a larger change, triangle is change in Y for a given fall in R. So if I of R had been bigger for a given, say from 10% to 4%, investment goes up even more, so income goes up even more. So if I of R had been larger, we would have gotten a bigger change, and the IS curve would be even flatter. And so as I of R goes up, you get a bigger change in Y for a given fall in R. The bigger the change in Y, the flatter the IS curve. So that's the intuition for the slope of the IS curve. And sorry to have to backtrack like that. So let's get back on track. Too many tracks. All right. So we've derived the LM curve. Let's do shifts in the LM curve. So what's going to make the LM curve shift? The main thing I want to focus on is a change in the money supply. So let's do that. So we've got our real money supply, M over P. Real money demand, Y0 L of I. Call this M0 up here. So at M0, we are at R0 and Y0. Now let's assume the LM curve has already been derived. Its position is going to depend upon M over P. And let's find the point we're at, R0, Y0. So we're at that point. Now we're going to hold income constant at Y0, change M, and see what happens to R. Alrighty? So let's let M go up. That's going to cause M over P to go up if we hold P constant. So that's going to shift this out to M1 over P. So that's going to cause the interest rate to fall. Income hasn't changed. So now we're at that point right there. Well, that's a combination R and Y that's in equilibrium. It has to be on the LM curve, since that's what the LM curve is all those points. So the LM curve must have shifted out. Same thing would happen, by the way, if I'd have just let the price level go down. This would shift out as well. So what matters for the LM curve is that M over P. But what's important for us is when M goes up, M over P goes up, and that causes the IS curve to shift to the right, to shift out. Some people get confused. You could describe this shift two ways. It either shifts down or it shifts out, either one. Similarly, if you go the other direction, you can say it shifts up or in. So those are equivalent statements. Out and down for the LM curve would be same thing. So now we know how the LM curve shifts out when there's a change in M or a fall in P. There's other reasons it could shift too, but that's the only ones we're going to need. Now, the book does the LM curve. What it calls the LM curve is not what's traditionally called the LM curve. And so let me now try to show you how to get from, this is the traditional way to do the LM curve, and the book does it a different way entirely. So let me try to connect the two somehow. Not somehow, I will connect the two. Okay, so let's now put the IS and the LM curves together. So at this point, traditionally what you do is now say, okay, we've got this thing called the IS curve. That's all the R's and Y's for the goods market. We've got this thing called the LM curve, which is all the R's and Y's for the money market that are equilibrium. And so there's this one unique point right here, Y0 and R0, that's an equilibrium in both markets. Then traditionally what you would do at this point is look at, okay, this IS curve depends upon government spending and taxes, confidence, other things. This depends upon M over P. And so we could say, well, if government spending goes up, the IS curve would shift and income would go up and the interest rate would go up, or if M changed, something would happen. We're not going to do that because this model assumes that the Fed targets the money supply, when in fact what the Fed targets these days, that was true a long time ago when they built this ISLM model, assuming the Fed targeted M was a good assumption, but they don't do that anymore. What they target is the interest rate. And so we want to somehow capture that in our model. So traditionally, monetary policy was viewed as a change in M. So what you would do is say, well, the economy is in a recession. We need to increase the money supply, say to M1 over P. Hopefully that'll increase income, and at the same time, it ought to decrease the interest rate. And so we viewed the Fed as controlling this thing M. But that's really not what they do today. They actually control, what they really control is something called the federal funds rate. But essentially they control interest rates. Now, let me back up for just a second and go back to the money demand, money supply diagram and make a simple point. That the Fed can't control M and R at the same time. This should be M here, R. So what I'm trying to show you is that the Fed has to make a choice between an interest rate target and a money target. The LM curve is derived under the assumption that they have a money target. So I'm going to go back to the nominal version of this. So there's some target for money, M star. And you've got this P, Y, L of I, money demand. And let's just say you're lucky and you have some interest rate target and you just happen to be at both to start off here. So you're both at the interest rate target and the money target. Then let's suppose there's some shock, some reason why maybe prices change or something else happens. But for some reason, this money demand curve shifts. So say the price level goes up. Say there's an oil price shock or something. Something makes the price level go up. Well, now suddenly, we're no longer at our interest rate target, but we're still at our money target. And so now we're only at one of our targets. We're not at both. We could stay at our money target, or if we wanted to, we could increase the money supply to get back to the interest rate target. But you can't stay at both. You have to make a choice. And so the Fed has to make a choice between, do I want to keep the interest rate constant until I decide to change it to a new target? But do I want to target the interest rate, or do I want to target the money supply? The LM curve was built on the assumption that they targeted the money supply. But that's not what they do these days. As I've said, they target the interest rate. So when they target the money supply, what happens is the interest rate adjusts. You can't control the interest rate. So just to do the same examples as before, you've got P, Y, L of I, some price shock. You've got M star, starting off at R star. If you want to keep a money target and there's these shocks, the interest rate is the variable that adjusts. So now we would go up here to R. So we're going to keep the money fixed at M star because we've got a money target as the Fed. That's our operating procedure. We target the money supply. Well, in that case, M is exogenous. It's determined by the Fed. And R is endogenous. It's going to adjust to give you an equilibrium in the goods market. It could be anywhere. So R is the endogenous or the adjusting variable, and M is the exogenous or the variable chosen by the Fed. The way it works now is that that's completely reversed. Now what the Fed does is it targets an interest rate. So here's M, R, M, P. I'll keep using the same example, let price change. So here's our interest rate target, R star. Now when there's a disturbance, like an increase in the price level to P1, Y, L of I, what the Fed does is it just lets the money do the adjusting. So it'll look out into markets and it'll say, oh, the interest rate's above target. So it'll start engaging in open market operations and increasing the money supply and bringing the interest rate back down to target. So now what would happen is the money supply would adjust. Now the money supply is the endogenous or the adjusting variable, and R is the chosen variable or the exogenous variable. And so monetary policy is just a horizontal line at R star. Okay, let's go back to the ISLM. So let's start off with interest rate target. So last time the way we did monetary policy, traditionally the way we thought about monetary policy is the Fed would manipulate this M to hit some goal. But that's not how it works anymore. What the Fed does is they control the money supply. So let's suppose that for some reason the IS curve shifts out. Maybe there's a change in taxes or maybe business confidence changes, something like that. And the IS curve shifts out. Under a money target, you wouldn't do anything because you're still at M. You would let R adjust to whatever the money target is. You'd let R adjust to make equilibrium. But now what happens is the Fed has this money target, or interest rate target, sorry. So what it'll do is it'll increase the money supply. It'll say, oh, the interest rate's too high. Excuse me. In markets. So what we need to do is increase the money supply to bring the economy back to our targeted level of the interest rate. And when all was said and done, income would have gone up. But now M is just adjusted to whatever it needs to be. There is no money target like in the old days. M is just adjusted to whatever it needs to be in order to maintain the interest rate target. So you're always going to end up along this horizontal line. No matter what happens, the Fed will adjust M to keep R at R star. So what the book does is it just dispenses with the traditional LM curve altogether, and it writes the IS LM curve as here's Y and R, here's the IS curve. For the book, the LM curve is just a horizontal line at the interest rate target, because the Fed's going to do whatever it needs to do to the money supply to make sure that we're at that interest rate target. Now, I really don't like calling this an LM curve, because traditionally the LM curve is an upward sloping curve that reflects a money target. In most places, this would be called an MP curve for monetary policy. Our policy is R star in this case. Sometimes the policy is more complicated. You get an upward sloping curve. And it's usually called the MP, or the monetary policy curve. This book calls it the LM curve. I don't want to confuse you by using two different names, MP and LM, for the same thing. So I'm going to go ahead and call this the LM curve, slightly under protest. And so whenever, unless I really say otherwise, and make it clear I'm talking about the old-fashioned LM curve, when I use the term LM on exams or quizzes or review questions, or from here on, we're going to mean the book's horizontal LM curve. And it just shows that monetary policy is a fixed interest rate. At that policy, you would get Y0. The book often doesn't have a star here, and they just call this the policy rate, and it's understood that that's the variable that the Fed is controlling. Okay, so now we finally have our ISLM model as the book does them. Now we need to go through monetary and fiscal policy. So let's start with fiscal policy. Monetary policy is going to be easy. It's just going to be changes in the target interest rate. It'll move this line up or down. Fiscal policy is going to move the IS curve around. But let's go through it very quickly just so we can see how it works. It's pretty simple, I think, hopefully, for once. We'll see. Okay, so fiscal policy in the ISLM model. Nice Y. All right, so let's start off. Y, R, IS. I'm going to use government spending. An increase in government spending is going to look exactly like a decline in taxes. Or I could use business confidence or consumer confidence. When they go up, it's going to shift the IS curve just like an increase in G. So I'm using an increase in G, but it's more general. It's exactly the same as for a decline in taxes or an increase in confidence. So anything that's going to shift this IS curve. So here's our target. I think the book calls this R bar. Maybe even I bar. Let me look real quick, make sure I'm using the right. Oh, the book uses I, and I've been using R. Again, they're the same. Oh well. I and R are the same for now. So the book calls this I bar. The reason I was using R, when we get to chapter 9, this is suddenly going to flip to R in the book. So the book's a bit inconsistent. I was going to try to use R all the way through, but I guess if I want to do the same thing the book does, I better use an I. So I bar is the Fed's interest rate target. At that target, we would get an output level of Y. Call it Y0. Now let's suppose there's an increase in government spending, taxes go down. This is the example I'll use. Confidence goes up, so on. That's going to shift the IS curve out to IS of G1. And at G1, income would be Y1. And so when government spending goes up, that causes aggregate demand to go up, and then that causes income to go up. And so that's really all there is to it. I should have put LM here. You probably don't want to write this down, but in the old days, the LM curve would have looked like this. And if the Fed had, and this would be LM of, say, M0 over P, what the Fed then does is increase the money supply to LM of M1 over P in order to maintain their money target. And so in terms of our other model, that's what would be going on. Government spending goes up, that puts upward pressure on the interest rate. The Fed responds by loosening policy to keep the interest rate at its targeted level. All right, that's fiscal policy. Monetary policy. Let's do monetary policy next. Anything else I wanted to say there? No. This is equally easy. Here's Y and I. Finally got it right. Here's I bar 0. That's their initial policy. Here's the IS curve. I'm not going to put the arguments in because we're not going to change any of them. Here's I. And this is LM. Monetary policy is just a new interest rate target. So let's say the Fed thinks that income's too low, full employment's out here somewhere. So what it'll do is they'll meet and they'll say, okay, let's change the interest rate target to I bar 1. Let's lower the target. And when they do that, income will go up to Y1. And so monetary policy is just the change in the interest rate. So the outcome is that you get a higher level of income. What goes on is that when the interest rate goes down, that causes investment to go up, which causes income to go up. That should look exactly like our discussion about the slope of the IS curve, because it is. You move from there to there. That is the slope. And you can see that how much Y is going to change for a given monetary policy is going to depend upon the slope of that IS curve. So that's what we're going to do next, is policy effectiveness. You may want to draw a different graph. I'll kind of pace around here for a second in case you want to do that. Or I guess you could hit pause button, huh? I'm going to do it in the same graph. If in a recession, the responsiveness of investment to the interest rate goes down, and the IS gets steeper. So the IS curve tends to be steeper in recessions than it is at full employment. So this might be the full employment picture. This is how much output would go up because investment's fairly responsive. In a recession, this IS curve might be steeper. So this is the one for I of R smaller. In that case, the change in income would only be to Y1 prime. So instead of going all the way here to Y1, you only go to Y1 prime. So what does that tell you about the effectiveness of monetary policy? Well, it tells you that in recessions, monetary policy is not as effective as it is at full employment. And so at full employment, monetary policy tends to be really effective. It's really good at slowing down the economy. When you're at full employment and you see inflation, the Fed can jack up the interest rate. That'll have a big effect on investment, and that'll bring aggregate demand and inflation back down. In a recession, lowering the interest rate doesn't do much for investment for the reasons we talked about earlier. There's already a lot of excess capacity. Why bother to invest? And so in that case, monetary policy loses its effectiveness. And so that's the first point. So the section we're doing right now is policy effectiveness. Monetary policy effectiveness. So in a recession, the responsiveness of investment, the responsiveness of I to R, or I, makes no difference, falls, and that causes the IS curve to be steeper, and monetary policy is less effective. And again, just to redraw it quick, there's the recession IS curve. There's the full employment IS curve. There's your initial interest rate, I0, initial level of income. When we drop the interest rate to I1, effectiveness means how much it impacts income. In this case, it's really small. So there's the recession. Near full employment, exactly the same policy gives you, let's say near full employment, the exact same policy gives you a much bigger change in income. Now there's actually a case where monetary policy can become completely ineffective in a recession. And this brings up something called the zero lower bound, or it's sometimes called the liquidity trap. Let me show you this. So here's Y, I. Here's our initial policy, I bar naught. Here's the IS curve. And let's just assume that monetary policy has been managed so that this is the natural rate, what the book calls YN. This is full employment, the natural rate of output. And then, like in the Great Recession, something happens that shifts this IS curve way back. In fact, so far back that it intersects the y-axis at something less than YN. So then the economy goes into this big recession. What would the Fed start doing? Well, the Fed's going to want to lower the interest rate, right? So the Fed starts lowering the interest rate, just like it did right in 2007 after the recession. They were pretty aggressive in bringing it down. So they start bringing the interest rate down. Output begins going up. But eventually, they hit this zero lower bound. This is zero. And you can't have negative interest rates. Some people say you can. That's irrelevant because the Fed was really unwilling to do it even if you could. They were not going to push the interest rate below zero because they were worried about, that's really uncharted territory. We don't know what's going to happen. And it's limited anyway. I don't even want to get into the discussion. So you've got this zero lower bound. So the Fed can bring the interest rate. This is the LM curve is now this horizontal axis, right? It's brought the LM curve down as far as it can possibly go, and yet we're sitting at this point where So here I equals a zero lower bound in this case, and we're still not at full employment. And there's nothing else the Fed can do. It can't lower the interest rate any further. It could do things like quantitative easing or other sorts of unconventional monetary policies, which might have a little bit of an impact on income. But basically, the Fed becomes pretty powerless once you hit the zero lower bound in a deep recession. In fact, in that case, let me redraw it. What you're really going to need is fiscal policy to get you out of it. Oops, meant not to use that pen because it's got no ink. All right, I, Y. So we've got this IS curve hitting here. Full employment is here. We're at this equilibrium. I is the zero lower bound at this point. So this is the LM curve along here. One way to get back to full employment is to use fiscal policy. You could cut taxes or increase government spending. That's why so many of us were calling for fiscal policy during the Great Recession. It seemed to a lot of us we were clearly stuck in at this zero lower bound, that monetary policy had no chance to get us back to full employment. So we either had to wait years and years and years for the economy to self-recover finally, or we could use fiscal policy to shift this IS curve out. And many people wanted, myself included, government spending to go up in the form of infrastructure spending, because we needed that anyway. Interest rates were low, it was cheap, labor was cheap, raw materials were cheap. A good time to do infrastructure, and it has this benefit of shifting the IS curve, and you might get closer to full employment. As you begin increasing government spending, you'll move closer to full employment. But of course, what the government actually did was austerity, and they actually moved the IS curve a little bit in the wrong direction, which was silly. But anyway, so in a deep recession where the IS curve intersects the horizontal axis before at a point less than YN, monetary policy is not effective at all. Or the non-traditional policies can have some effectiveness, but it doesn't have much effectiveness. And so that's a case when you're really going to need to rely on fiscal policy if you want to stimulate output. So what we're saying is that as we go into a recession, that parameter I of R begins falling, which causes monetary policy to be less effective, but it still has effectiveness. Then, in big recessions, if lowering the interest rate puts you at the zero lower bound, yet Y is still less than YN, then monetary policy in this model is completely ineffective. You could lower output even more by raising the interest rate, so it's not ineffective in that sense. But there's nothing you can do to stimulate output to move you back closer to full employment with monetary policy. So there's a role for fiscal policy in this particular case. All right, cool. All right, just a couple more things here. And so the last topic that we need to talk about is what's called using a policy mix. We have been doing all of this as though monetary and fiscal policy alone are implemented. But you could also imagine the monetary and fiscal authorities cooperating either directly or implicitly and using what's called a policy mix. So using a policy mix. Okay. Let's suppose, so here's y. This is kind of what we just talked about. IS. That is not the IS curve. LM. IS. So we're sitting at this level of output y0. And out here somewhere is yn, full employment, the natural rate. If we want to get out of this recession, one thing we could do is, monetary policy alone is not going to get us there, because if we lower the interest rate all the way to 0, we're going to end up at that point. That's the zero lower bound liquidity trap case we just talked about. But if we use a combination policy, say we lower the interest rate a little bit, LM prime, while at the same time implementing government spending, we can get back to full employment without hitting the 0 lower bound. So there's I bar 0, I bar 1, lowered the interest rate, also increased government spending from, say, G0 to G1, and we got back to full employment. So there's several advantages of using a combination policy to get out of a deep recession. First of all, we could have just used fiscal policy all by itself. So I could have just started here and shifted all the way out to this point, used even more fiscal policy to get back to full employment. But fiscal policy leads to a deficit going up because we're increasing government spending or cutting taxes, both of which would cause the deficit to go up. A combination policy or a policy mix, deficit goes up less because monetary policy is doing part of the work. So that's the first advantage of a policy mix. You can avoid the deficit. The second one is it avoids the 0 lower bound problem. So you don't have to worry so much about the 0 lower bound problem. And the last thing is that, I'm going to have to erase this. If you don't have it down yet, hit the pause button. Monetary and fiscal policy have different implications for the composition of output differently. By composition, so y equals c plus I plus g, we mean the amount of c, the amount of I, and the amount of g. So we could change if we're holding y constant, we can change the composition by changing ci or g relative to the others. When the interest rate goes down, that causes investment to go up. When government spending goes up, that's G up. And so in that case, what's happening is that you're increasing I and G relative to C. But if you were to instead use a decline in taxes that's going to cause consumption to go up and investment to go up. When taxes go down, disposable income goes up, and that raises consumption. It also raises income, which raises both consumption and investment. And so in that case, there's no change in G and a change in C and I. So if you have a targeted composition, like you want a certain amount of investment, a certain amount of consumption, and a certain amount of G, using these combination policies can allow you to sort of hit that composition more accurately. And so you may want to either avoid a particular composition or move towards one, and using combination policies allows you to do that. The final advantage of a combination policy is that you may not be sure, so neither monetary or fiscal policy, it's a little sloppy, neither monetary or fiscal policy works perfectly. So using both is insurance against one not working. Say you just want to rely on government spending alone, and for some reason the multiplier was 0, not going to do anything. Well, if you would use a combination policy, at least you'd get the monetary side. And so using these combination policies could sort of insulate against unexpectedly poor performance of your policy variable. In that case, the two policies work together. They both shifted output out. Sometimes it's worthwhile. Sometimes the best combination policy is for one of them to increase output and one of them to decrease output. So let's look at an example. So here's our LM curve at I bar naught, LM, ISLM. And let's start off at full employment. And let's suppose that what the Fed or what the government wants to do is reduce the deficit. So it's going to either cut government spending or increase taxes. So when it does that, the IS curve, I didn't want to draw it quite that way. I needed to intersect this thing. The IS curve will shift in. So it'll shift in when the deficit goes down, either because government spending went down or taxes went up. Without a combination or a policy mix, you would end up here in a recession because of the fiscal consolidation, as the book calls it. But if the Fed at the same time were to lower the LM curve, lower the policy rate to I1, you'll end up back at YN. So you've got one policy pushing output down and the other policy pushing them up so that on balance you stay right where you were. So this would allow the government to cut the deficit without worrying about causing a recession, so long as the Fed were cooperative. I mean, the Fed's independent. It may or may not want to go along with that, but if the Fed's cooperative, that's going to work. All right, so there you go. Notice if you were at the zero bound already, this is what we were talking about earlier, then you couldn't offset it. And so fiscal consolidation in a deep recession is a really bad idea, even though that's exactly what we did in the Great Recession. Okay, last thing for this chapter. Oh, I meant to say, in this case, same example. So what happens to the composition of output in this case? just like before, investment goes down, government spending goes down. This is going to cause investment to go up. This is G. If you look at C, Y equals C plus I plus G. If this is the way you do it, here's your fiscal consolidation, your reduction in the deficit, here's the Fed's offset. What will happen is you'll get more investment, less government spending. Remember, YN doesn't change. And so these completely offset. So really all you're doing is moving from government spending to private sector investment. If you were to use, again, the monetary policy will cause I to go up. If instead we had raised taxes, this would cause consumption to go down. So in this case, I'm writing YN here to emphasize this side stays constant. What we'd be doing is trading household consumption for business investment as we did our fiscal consolidation. And if you did both, T and G, it's going to be some combination. G would go down, C would go down, and I would go up. So depending on which policy you choose, investment's going to go up in this case no matter what. But whether you pay for the extra investment by reducing consumption or reducing government spending depends on which choice you make about fiscal policy. And the last point is that the monetary and fiscal policy makers don't always cooperate. So back when Bush was president, LM, IS, T0, the Bush administration wanted to cut taxes, and one of the benefits, it's not the only reason they wanted to cut taxes, but one of the benefits was they thought that output needed to go up. They wanted to stimulate the economy. So they said, okay, what we're going to do is cut taxes, and that'll shift the IS curve out to IS of T1. Alan Greenspan, in testimony before Congress, said, you can go ahead and do that if you want. But the Fed doesn't think output should go up. It's going to be inflationary. So if you cut taxes, what we're going to do is raise the interest rate and offset it. So yeah, you may get your tax cut, but you shouldn't expect to get any output kick out of it because the Fed doesn't agree that output needs to go up. And so the two branches don't always cooperate in that sense. This would be a combination policy, but it wouldn't be one that they both agreed upon. Okay, well, that ends this chapter. I guess this was a little longer than some of the others, but so that's it. Let me make sure. Yep. So I will see you next time.